Hello, and welcome to a League of Women Voters candidate debate. I'm Carol Mulready, Chair of Voter Service of the League of Women Voters of Greater Hartford, and will serve as the moderator for this debate for the Democrat primary for the 18th Assembly District of Connecticut. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization which encourages informed and active participation by citizens in government. We are pleased to bring you this debate in cooperation with West Hartford Community Television. The debate will be conducted in a modified cumulative time format. This format is designed to enable candidates to freely elaborate on their approaches to a variety of issues, unimpeded by strict time constraints of other models. Each candidate will have a total of 20 minutes of response time during this debate. When speaking, the candidates are timed by his or her own timekeeper, a member of the League of Women Voters. Periodically, the timekeepers hold up signs indicating the amount of time remaining for each candidate. Candidates are encouraged to rebut and surrebut, responding to their differences as they perceive them, understanding that the clock is running. Each round of questions is initiated by the moderator. For this event, there will be a couple of questions that are prepared by the League of Women Voters, but we have an audience that has been invited to submit questions for the candidates, and I will ask those questions to those candidates. Each candidate will have an opening statement of 2 minutes, and the order of precedence for speaking was determined by coin toss. It's my pleasure now to introduce the candidates to you. They are Jillian Gilchrest and Andy Fleischmann. And with the coin toss, Andy has selected to give the first opening statement.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you to the League of Women Voters and WHC-TV for putting on this event. I'm State Representative Andy Fleischmann. It's been a true honor for me to serve my beloved hometown and all of you in the legislature, and I'm hoping that this coming Tuesday you will go ahead and keep me as your Democratic nominee with your vote. During these past 2 challenging years, we were able to accomplish some very important things. Despite proposals from the governor to cut support for our town, we won a $3 million increase in education funding for our schools, reducing pressure on our local property taxes. We banned bump stocks, reducing the likelihood that a bad actor could turn a semi-automatic weapon into a killing machine, much like a machine gun. And we passed one of the first statewide pay equity laws, ensuring that no employer could ask a potential new hire about their past pay. I believe, though, that there's a lot of work left to do. In the next 2 years, I'd like to establish earned family medical leave so that no one ever has to choose between their job and their family's health. Strengthen job creation by ensuring that we have more incubator space for new businesses and more housing for new workers, just as has been done in Pittsburgh. Finally, protect and, if possible, increase state support for West Hartford schools. There is really no better investment in our future and our community that we could possibly make. To win these progressive victories, I'll need your help. I ask you for your vote this Tuesday, and then for your activism in the general election that follows. Working together, we can help Connecticut to be a true blue state that wins more progressive measures in the coming years. Thank you so much for your engagement, for your past support, and for your consideration this coming Tuesday. I look forward to the debate that's about to come.
And Jillian.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see such a big turnout. I'm Jillian Gilchrest. I want to thank the League of Women Voters, West Hartford Community Television, my supporters who are here tonight, and my husband who's home with our children. I, like many of you, moved to this community because my husband and I fell in love with West Hartford. We love the tree-lined streets, we love the center, we love the parks, the schools, but most importantly, we love the people here. And I have decided to run for state representative because I am worried for our community and our state. The state budget is in quite a bit of trouble and has been for some time. And I think we need to elect leaders who are willing to take action. For the last 15 years, I've worked on public policy at the state capitol for a number of nonprofits and have been incredibly effective. And so I want to use those skills to address our state budget, but also to champion social justice issues. And although my opponent indicates he, too, wants to support some of those, like paid family and medical leave, what I mean by championing is actually getting them passed into law. And finally, I want to use my skills as a social worker to continue reaching out to this community and listening and learning from you what are the issues that are impacting you and how can I use my skills to translate those into effective public policy. It has been a pleasure knocking on doors and meeting more folks in this community, and I would be honored to serve as your state representative, and so I hope you do vote for me on Tuesday, August 14th. I look forward to tonight's debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Make sure that each of you speaks directly into the microphone, and if it's not close to you, please bring it toward you. Thank you. First question, the Education Cost Sharing Formula, ECS, has been tweaked time and time again without significant results. Do you have a plan to meaningfully change how we fund education in the state of Connecticut? And that goes to Jillian first.
Thank you for the question. Yes, there have been many tweaks to the education cost sharing formula. And in fact, the education cost sharing formula has not been fully funded since, for our community, since 1996, which is actually around the time my opponent took office. There are 10 different funding streams at the state level for education, for public education, including the ECS formula. And so one of my proposals would be to dive in and be able to clean that 10 different streams up. I think we also need to designate certain revenue directly to public education. And so, for example, if we are to establish a tax on online sales, I think that that online sales tax should go directly to paying for public education. And finally, Connecticut is one of 4 states that doesn't have a statewide system for funding special education. And in the town of West Hartford, our special education costs are actually the driver that is increasing our funding here. Special education is incredibly important, and West Hartford is actually a destination town for folks who need special education services. And so I think we could benefit from that. There is a study taking place, but like many things in Connecticut, my fear is we will study it and it won't go anywhere, and so I do think we need to take action.
Thank you. Andy.
Thank you, Carol. So there have been significant changes to the ECS formula in the last few years that have helped our town. It used to be that children who had English as a second language were not included in the formula. Now they are. It used to be that we didn't use an actual factor related to poverty, but instead used free and reduced price lunch as a proxy for poverty. Now we use census data. All of the changes that have been made have inured to the benefit of the town of West Hartford. And this is in a context where we've had a governor who did not believe our town needed more dollars, even though everyone in this room understands that we have an incredibly diverse school population, a high number of kids with special needs, a high number of kids in poverty, a high number of kids who come to school not knowing English. So I'm proud of having achieved that. I do think that long term, it would be a nice thing for us to consolidate the multiple formulas my opponent just referenced. The reality is that every single state representative, every single state senator comes to Hartford talking about bringing more dollars to their community. So those who want to do a complete overhaul tend to walk away with less rather than more because it's the tweaks that end up being passable. Finally, with regard to special education, I helped turn back a proposal that would have deeply damaged the town of West Hartford by eliminating the excess cost formula. In plain language, it would have switched us from a formula that pays attention to towns serving kids with lots of needs to just a generalized formula relating to overall costs. would have cost us millions of dollars. I took the lead on turning that back, and I took the lead on creating a task force that's going to look at a brand new model that would essentially create a captive insurance approach to special ed, which would both reduce costs and smooth costs so that we would have greater predictability. So in short, I'm happy about some of the changes that we've managed to win in a tough environment and ready to keep fighting for West Hartford and what will continue to be a tough environment as education chair.
Any follow-up?
It's interesting to hear my opponent talk about this tough environment and what he's done to help West Hartford when he's been at the legislature for the last 23 years and created this tough environment. The problems in our state with our budget haven't developed overnight. They've taken decades, decades that he has been in office. The last ECS formula tweak that he references is actually based on a projection for revenue that we aren't anticipating to get in. So once again, the state legislature, led by my opponent, the chair of the Education Committee, is basing a proposal on something that is just not going to happen. And so we need to stop and actually go back and revamp the entire budget, because we can keep making these tweaks, but we need to make serious change in this state if we are going to support public education, which I know is incredibly important to the people in this room, in this community, and to myself.
Just to rebut. So I find it ludicrous for anyone running for the state house to imply that any single member is responsible for the tough environment that our state faces. Anyone in this room, anyone living in this state knows that after the Great Recession, we've had a lot of challenges, as have many of our neighboring states. Some of the challenges we face go back a long ways. The state teacher retirement system is over 100 years old, and the underfunding of it started when I was in elementary school. Nonetheless, whoever's in the legislature is going to have to be ready to tackle those challenges, not by just having rhetoric about fresh ideas which are not filled in, but by actually putting forward proposals like creative approaches to special ed, such as a captive insurance system. It's more than words that are required. It's actual ideas, actual proposals. That's what I've been doing, and that's what I look forward to doing.
All right, thank you very much. And going on to another question, let's take a look at the environment. We call our Department of Energy and Environmental Protection DEEP for short. And we in Connecticut now have these huge deficits that I'm sure we'll be talking about. It seems easy to forget the environment in the midst of those challenges with taxes and deficits and the like. But our natural resources do much to enhance our quality of life and make this state a wonderful place to live. We're facing a number of environmental issues that pose threats to our ongoing health and safety, like bears recently, ticks and mosquitoes, water pollution, bacteria, and recreational swim areas. All of this happens while DEEP has a consistent series of budget cuts. How would you address keeping attention on preserving our natural resources, air, water, land, recreation, and more, while maintaining the health, safety, and quality of life for our residents?
Thank you. That is a big question. Let me just say that I'm a lifelong environmentalist. For the first 6 years that the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters kept a scorecard, I scored 100%. They then tried to make the grading a little tougher. I went down to 96%. But I am an environmentalist and believe that whatever's happening with the budget, we have to stay committed to clean air, clean water, and a good environment. This past year, I supported a bill that puts Connecticut on a course to cutting its CO2 emissions in the coming decade significantly. It also sets up a system for us to monitor our shorelines so that if global warming starts to do damage to Connecticut shorelines, we'll be aware of it and able to take proactive steps. In the past budget cycle, I fought for and won, along with colleagues of like mine, $10 million for the clean energy programs that have been pushed away by some who cared less about clean energy. That, of course, helps reduce CO2 emissions and is good for the environment. So in short, I do think it's possible to be a committed environmentalist in this environment. I've been one, and I look forward to continuing to be one if I'm lucky enough to be reelected.
Jillian?
We're fortunate to be in a state that has set some wonderful goals with regards to the environment by 2050. But again, what I fear is that because of the budget restraints here in the state, we are going to be set back, as well as what's going on at the federal level, most recently in the news. For folks who don't know, the Energy Efficiency Fund, which lawmakers created to help us get to those goals, has been raided. And again, that's because of the budget problems here in the state. And so one solution I would propose is to finally let Tesla here into the state. There has been a bill for the last 4 years. Not only could bringing Tesla into the state get us much needed sales tax, which could then go back to funding, fully funding that energy efficiency fund, it's good for the environment, and it would also create jobs. It's an example of where my opponent says he supports something, but then doesn't work with his colleagues to actually get it across the finish line. 4 years of conversation about Tesla is far too much. We could have gotten that through, and it could be investing energy efficiency for the future.
So just to rebut, the notion that Tesla is going to solve Connecticut's environmental problems is a head scratcher, since A, as anyone who drives Connecticut roads and highways knows, Tesla vehicles are in Connecticut. The fight is between Connecticut auto dealers and Tesla, which does not want to follow the retail model that this state has had for auto sales for more than a century. They want to break that model in order to sell directly to people, which potentially exposes consumers. Because if there is not an auto dealer standing between you and the producer, there's a chance that if something goes wrong, if the automaker goes under, you have no recourse. You have nobody to turn to. So I have nothing against Tesla vehicles. They're beautiful. I'd love to own one someday. But the notion that putting Tesla dealerships into Connecticut is going to help our environment or our economy is something that virtually every person I've spoken to in the auto industry disputes.
Okay, Rebecca.
I think it's important to actually have solutions that are tied to funding. For my opponent to keep saying we're going to pass legislation that has no funding behind it is how we got into this mess, and is going to keep Connecticut on the same path where we are not improving our economy.
Thank you. Last prepared question for the time being is in the area of health. The current federal administration has proposed new short-term health insurance plans that do not cover for pre-existing conditions, maternity care, and other mandatory coverages established in the Affordable Care Act. In fact, by many reports, these plans cover very little. How would you propose we protect the health and safety of our Connecticut citizens in the possibility that these plans are put in place? And Jillian, you get the first answer.
Thank you for the question. I would first and foremost work with our Attorney General to try and prevent the short-term plans from being enacted here in the state. We are on good footing here in Connecticut in that a bill that just passed actually protects the 10 essential benefits from the Affordable Care Act. That is a policy that I worked on with various advocacy groups, testified in support of in my role at the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and have worked on for some time in other roles, including Women's March and in my volunteer work with NARAL Pro-Choice Connecticut. When it comes to pre-existing conditions, I think there's probably many in the room and folks who I've been meeting in the community who are concerned because this impacts so many of us. For women in particular, there's so many issues for us that are just deemed pre-existing conditions, like having had a child. And then for anyone who has family members who have chronic illness or who have experienced cancer, this is just a horrible thing to hear. So I think similar to the 10 essential benefits that we just passed here in Connecticut, it would be important for us to move forward and codify the protection of pre-existing conditions.
Thank you. Andy?
So I'm glad to hear my opponent mention the measure that protected 10 essential benefits for Connecticut residents. I was a co-sponsor of that measure, worked hard in front of the scenes and behind the scenes to make sure it passed. So just to be clear, whatever they do in Washington, pre-existing conditions are covered in the state of Connecticut. As a cancer survivor, I'm deeply appreciative to have that protection regardless of what happens in DC. Maternity care, protected in Connecticut, thanks to that new law. Neonatal care, protected in the state of Connecticut. Prophylactic and wellness care, protected in the state of Connecticut. And even something that was not always covered under all aspects of the Affordable Care Act, birth control, covered and protected in the state of Connecticut as part of the 10 essential benefits. So we have taken important steps forward to protect ourselves and be a firewall against some of the craziness happening in DC today. And I do think it's important for us to take that activism up a notch and try and make sure that our federal delegation wins some of the similar victories in Washington.
One of the jobs I hold is that I teach political advocacy at the UConn School of Social Work. And so I teach students how to go up to the legislature and move important pieces of legislation through that building. And one of the things I teach my students is that they can go to the clerk's office and get co-sponsor forms. They can pre-fill them out, and then they can hand them to lawmakers to ask that lawmaker to co-sponsor a bill. I do need to call attention to the fact that my opponent, since the start of this election, is claiming to be a champion and a fighter on so many bills. When I reach out to my colleagues who have worked on these for years, the colleagues that I've worked hard beside on these issues, they are surprised to hear him saying he's a fighter and a champion. He has not been in the room having these conversations. And signing a co-sponsor form is important. We do need people who are supporting policies. But we also need to elect lawmakers who fight for these issues when it isn't an election year.
Thank you. So, I do resent that last remark. Last time I checked, my opponent wasn't omniscient. She wasn't in the room when I spoke to a mother who talked about the hell that she went through when she didn't have proper neonatal coverage or even proper birth control coverage. She wasn't there when I asked for the form, filled it out, and submitted it myself because no one had asked me to be part of it. I felt strongly about it as someone who was a cancer survivor. I think it's important for those of you who are going to be voting to look at the record. There are plenty of people who are opposed to the measure that we're talking about. I'm proud to have been a supporter of it, and I reject my opponent's mischaracterization of the role that I played.
Thank you. Staying in the area of medical, we have a question from the audience. Do you support family medical leave? What would you do in office to pass it into law? And that goes to Jillian first.
I wholeheartedly support paid family and medical leave and think it is long overdue. I actually am the individual who started the coalition here in the state 5 years ago. I read a research report, saw that this was a policy that was starting to happen other places across the country, and so reached out to partners, reached out to the AARP, reached out to CBIA, reached out to folks who work on breastfeeding, just a variety of organizations who I knew would be committed to this issue. Formed that coalition, and 1 year's time, we were able to get a task force passed. Since then, there has been a bill for the last 4 years. On the outside of that building, I've done what I can. I am proud that we successfully got that bill through the Appropriations Committee, which was a huge hurdle. My opponent in his mailings, has said that he is a supporter, and that's great. But again, being a supporter of an issue like paid family and medical leave means that you reach out to your colleagues on the other side of the aisle. You work with folks to draft language. I've done all those things. And so if I get into office, I am ready to move that legislation through. There is a plan. It is ready to go. It is a policy that can benefit so many in the state. Obviously, I'm passionate about it. And so, yes, long overdue.
Okay, Andy?
I'm glad that my opponent shares my passion for earned family medical leave. It's the Working Families Party that has been the lead actor in moving that measure forward in the Connecticut General Assembly, the Working Families Party that endorsed my candidacy. Now, the bill has made progress. To get out of appropriations is good. To get a bill through the House and the Senate, you need 76 votes in the House and 19 votes in the Senate. So taking someone like me, a progressive who's been a strong supporter, and replacing me with someone else is not going to get you closer to the finish line. You have to get the additional votes. That means unelecting Trumpian Republicans and conservative Democrats who have not been willing to support the measure. I have many friends on both sides of the aisle. I talk to them about most issues. Someone who supports Donald Trump and who supports the Republican Party line is not going to be coming around to earned family medical leave. So I'm hopeful that with my opponent and most of you in this audience, wherever you may stand now, we'll be working together to make sure that come November, we go ahead and elect the majorities in both chambers that are needed to make a bill become a law.
All right, thank you. Do you wish to rebut?
I just want to clarify for the record that it's actually the Connecticut Women's Education and Legal Fund who chairs the campaign for paid family leave. They've chaired that for the last 4 years, and so they're the advocacy organization that are leading the efforts. The Working Families Party is certainly a part of that coalition, but that is being led by QUELF. About 3 years ago, we held a town hall meeting here in this very building, down in the auditorium. I extended an invitation to Representative Fleischmann. Senator Beth Bayh was there. He did not attend. Those are the types of things I think we need to do and we have done across the state to garner more support. I do think we can get Republicans to see the they already see the importance of this policy, having discussed it with them. I think it's a matter of the language, and I think by having important conversations, we can actually get this legislation across the finish line.
Just to respond, so elections matter. And my friends on the Republican side of the aisle who've been in opposition are not moving on this issue. It would be wonderful if they were, but they're not. It's not part of their political ideology, and they don't believe that their base of supporters want this measure. So for us to make sure that we get out there after this primary and work hard to elect progressive Democrats in more seats in the House and Senate is the right path to victory. That's the way we've won other challenging issues like getting gay marriage in the state of Connecticut, raising the minimum wage. A lot of those issues seemed hard initially, but as we elected more progressives, we got them.
Jillian?
I just want to comment that I think my opponent's take on Republicans versus Democrats as if it is the Red Sox versus the Yankees is how we've gotten Connecticut to the place we're in. Enough with the rhetoric up there. We need to work together to move this state forward in a positive way. And I think the difference you get when you elect me versus my opponent is that you're getting a leader who's going to work on good policy and who isn't just going to side with politics.
Andy?
So as a Red Sox fan, I am familiar with Red Sox versus Yankees. I really don't think that's how the legislature works. When I got my cancer diagnosis, a couple of the people who called me first and who spent time with me first were friends on the Republican side of the aisle. And there are some issues that we've worked together on. But there are some issues that relate to matters of fundamental political ideology where it's tougher. So, it's my pleasure to work with people on both sides of the aisle. That's how we won Holocaust and genocide education. That's how we won the food allergy bill this year. Those were bipartisan efforts that I've been proud to be part of. But you just need to recognize how reality works. Some issues you can work together with people from both chambers, both sides of the aisle. Some issues harder.
All right, here's an interesting question from our audience. What is your stance on ghost guns and the threat that 3D guns pose to our community or in the state?
So I'd like to answer briefly that I could not possibly be more opposed to the notion of someone being able to print a weapon using a 3D printer, buy a firing pin, and use it as a firearm in the state of Connecticut. That's why I was the first legislator in the state of Connecticut to call for a special session for us to address this challenge. It's outrageous that it's permitted anywhere in the United States of America. Basically, the NRA in Washington and in Hartford got farther than they should have in the last few months, but I think with the new attention that's come to the issue, we have a good chance of winning passage of a ban on ghost guns, just as we banned bump stocks a few months ago.
Thank you. Jillian?
I think it's horrifying that there's such a thing as ghost guns and that guns could be printed and should be banned at all cost. But what is interesting about my opponent's response is that there was a bill last legislative session to ban ghost guns in the state of Connecticut. And since he's using the standard of co-sponsor, he didn't even co-sponsor it. There were many of us who were working on that issue. I again held a group here I run a group called the WeHa Huddle, and we brought in some different gun groups to explain to us, some gun prevention groups, what this issue was, and then we made phone calls, we wrote letters, and so we worked to try and pass that legislation. It didn't even make it out of committee. So the fact that my opponent would call for a special session in light of what just happened federally, when again, our state cannot afford a special session, which would cost thousands of dollars, just to me proves he is not engaged enough. We need to elect a lawmaker who feels our sense of urgency and who is taking action every day of that legislative session.
So I'd just like to reject that characterization. You know, my opponent uses math in interesting ways. The cost of a special session is about $50,000. When you compare that to the potential cost of someone printing a gun and injuring or killing people in the state of Connecticut, it's de minimis. The political math of this one was ugly. The Judiciary Committee is a pretty conservative committee with more NRA friends than I'd like it to have, and the bill couldn't come out of committee because of that situation earlier this spring. It's my belief that the horror and upset that so many of us are feeling has become more widespread since there was a ruling in Texas, since there was a temporary injunction. That temporary injunction only protects us so long as it's in place, and then we could be in trouble again. So I do think a special session is absolutely the right thing for us to do, so that in the same way we've been a firewall against Trump's terrible ideas about health care, we can be a firewall against these printed guns if that injunction expires.
Thank you. Next question. In the era of Me Too, how could you suggest improvements in Connecticut's laws on sexual harassment? And Jillian, you get that first.
That is a great question. First and foremost, we need to look internally. And so the Connecticut General Assembly actually has some of the worst sexual harassment policies. Currently, if a staff person or a lobbyist gets sexually harassed by a lawmaker, their only recourse is to go to the chief of staff for that caucus. The chief of staff is hired by the legislators, so there is a conflict of interest, and currently, having worked in that building as a lobbyist and as a staffer, there's just a culture where you're never going to actually report if you are being sexually harassed by a lawmaker. So we need to go in and change those policies. Second, I would finish the job that wasn't finished, again, by my opponent and his colleagues in the House. There was a bill last legislative session, the Time's Up bill, which would have made stronger protections at businesses across this state with regards to sexual harassment, would have removed the statute of limitations for Connecticut sexual assault cases, which we are one of the lowest in the country. We have a 5-year statute of limitations. And I'd have to clean up my opponent's mess that he caused. In the last day of the legislative session, he actually passed an amendment that makes it harder for school personnel to file a sexual harassment claim. He passed an amendment on the floor of the House and urged his colleagues to vote on it, on an act concerning public education, which says that in order for an administrator in a public school to put someone on leave if they've been accused of sexual harassment, the person making the accusation has to both file the complaint and get a restraining order. For those that don't know, a civil restraining order, you can only get that in the state of Connecticut if you're in a relationship with someone. And so for many teachers, if they're being sexually harassed, first of all, they don't qualify for a restraining order if the person doing the sexual harassment is their colleague. And second of all, there's a lot of people who wouldn't want to get that restraining order. And so going into next year, we would have to clean that up. and then move on the Time's Up bill. Yeah, those are some of the actions I would take.
Andy?
So first, let me correct a mischaracterization and then move on to a deeper issue. The amendment that my opponent just referenced passed the House, not the Senate, so there's no cleanup needed. It's not a law. But it was not something to protect anyone. Rather, it addressed a situation that had happened in a couple of cities where there were administrators hired to help run city schools who already had restraining orders against them and allegations of sexual harassment. And the amendment that passed the House and not the Senate would have disallowed school districts from hiring individuals who already had that kind of record. So it was advocated for by friends of mine who supported the Time's Up bill. And it is a logical extension of that measure. With regard to the Connecticut General Assembly, my opponent's description of how it works if you suffer harassment at the state capitol is simply in error. So if you open up the bulletin of the Connecticut General Assembly, there's a list of 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans who anyone can approach if they feel that they've been sexually harassed. On that list are the heads of staff of the caucuses, but there's also people on the fifth floor who are nonpartisan. There are people who are involved in HR. And there are trainings that happen around the Capitol conducted by a very impressive West Hartford professional, making staff and lobbyists and legislators aware of those lists and the recourse available. On behalf of that very professional, savvy, trainer and leader against sexual harassment at the state capitol, I really take offense at the mischaracterization that my opponent offered. I do think things could be stronger, by the way. I think in addition to that list of 10, we should probably have some other outlets. But to say you can only go to one person who hired you is simply not the fact.
All right, let's move on to another question, because there are so many here, and I don't like this back and forth on mischaracterizations. We've had enough, okay, right now on that topic. I would like you to address the question from the audience. Do you support maintaining teachers' defined benefit pensions for current as well as future teachers? And Jillian, you get that first, I think. Yep.
Thank you for the question. So during this campaign process, I've reached out to many folks to better understand issues and did meet with the Connecticut Education Association, learned more about the fact that teachers don't receive Social Security, which is something I didn't know. You can't know everything going into this position, but the way I work and will work as your next state representative is that I will reach out and learn. And so after having those conversations, I do see that we would need to continue the defined benefit program going forward with regards to teachers.
Andy?
So I agree with my opponent. You know, the fact is that teachers have spent a career paying into their teachers' retirement system for their benefit with an understanding of what they would get out. And in fact, I so strongly believe in that I was one of those who met with the state treasurer and the then Speaker of the House to put the contributions that the state makes into the teachers' retirement system into a pension obligation bond, which in plain English means that we committed to 30 years of payments into the teachers' retirement system, the same way people make payments for their mortgages. I was proud to work with the Treasurer and the Speaker on that. It means that since that bill was enacted, we've had full funding, and we will continue to for the next 20 or so years.
Okay. Staying in the education, sort of, there's a question here about unions, and the questioner says that some Republicans are scapegoating unions. Do you support organized labor, such as the state university professors? Andy, I believe you get that first.
So my answer is yes. I support them and they support me, and I'm proud of it. You know, there's a problem that's been going on, which is scapegoating, which is looking at a tough budget and saying, oh, you know, the current professors or the current employees at such and such an agency are to blame. And that's not how it works. Most people who went into work for the state of Connecticut probably could have been making more had they gone to the private sector. And part of the balance that they struck was knowing that they would have a benefit package while they were employed and after they were employed that could give them some assurances. So that being said, I do think it's also important that our elected officials are ready to talk with the unions if it looks like the budget makes things difficult. That's what I've discussed with Ned Lamont, that if indeed the next budget cycle looks as hard as it appears right now, that he should be sitting down with the CBAC coalition, because the reality is only the governor has the power and authority to negotiate with state employee unions.
Thank you. Jillian?
I certainly think that the state unions have become the scapegoat when the real problem is the legislators for the last 20, 30, 40 years not funding the promises that they made. And so walking across this community and knocking on doors, when I've spoken with people, they are concerned for their future. They've worked hard for this state and for this community, and they're fearful that they're not going to get the pension that they were owed, that they were promised by the state. And so I think, one of my first actions on day one is getting in there and seeing how we can work with that budget to pay off debt. And so if we are to move on some of the things that have been studied for far too long, so if we are to move on legalizing marijuana or taxing sugary drinks, we need to then connect those revenues immediately back to paying off the debt owed to the pension system.
Okay. Andy? Sorry, looking at my wrong column here. Thank you. All right. The next questions have to do with the fiscal crisis. How will you work with Republicans to find bipartisan support to fix the state's financial crisis? Please give specific examples.
So I was part of the bipartisan efforts that led to bipartisan budgets in 2017 and 2018. And, you know, bipartisanship is not a cure-all. The budget enacted in 2017 had a lot of things that deeply concerned me. And I'm very grateful for the fact that in 2018 we were able to make adjustments to fix some of those problems. So, for example, there was defunding of the State Department of Education to such a degree that the great mentoring program that we have for new teachers called the TEAM system would have been eliminated, and I got those dollars back. But that whole process in 17 and 18 related to having an intransigent governor who really would not talk in a reasonable way with legislators, so that on the Appropriations Committee we did work across the aisle. And I think there's a good chance that the next 2 years may necessitate a similar process. So having done it the last 2 years, I feel confident I can do it again.
The first thing I do going in is revamp the system, work with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to revamp the way things are done at the state legislature. My second job in life was at the Connecticut General Assembly. I was the committee clerk to the Appropriations Committee and a legislative aide. And not much has changed since 2006. The Appropriations Committee, which is the budget-making committee, still meets separate from the Finance Committee. I think those two committees should start meeting together on day one. I don't think we can continue down the path of having the same process we've had for years after year, which is to wait for the governor to put out their budget, and then the Appropriations Committee responds. I think we're all fully aware that the state budget is in trouble, and so I think on day one, we need to be having conversations with the Appropriations Committee and the Finance Committee to move this state forward.
Would you raise taxes on millionaires? Jillian, you get that first.
I would keep the income tax structure the same currently. I would make a tax on online sales. I am in favor of tolls, which I think, again, are a perfect example of something that's been studied to death. There's a perfectly good study from 2009 that we could roll out. I look to a report that was done, I'm not going to remember the name right now, but by a commission to look at how we can move Connecticut forward. And when that report got released this past legislative session, it immediately became a partisan divide of folks just jumping in and saying, we don't like this, we don't like that, and then no one's going to meet in the middle. I think we should take that report, which people put time and energy into. It had good things in it, like increasing the minimum wage. It had the idea about combining the committees. And I think we need to stop reinventing the wheel every legislative session. Yes, thank you.
Okay, Andy?
So the body to which my opponent refers is the Commission on Fiscal Stability. And initially, its recommendations were looked at closely, but its recommendations started shifting as that body met with legislators. And by the time they had finished reformulating what they were putting forward, the progressive elements had mainly disappeared, and the regressive elements had moved to the fore, so that those who sat on the commission would have done very well by its tax recommendations. But those of us who are working in middle-class families would have taken it on the chin. So the question that was posed was about the millionaire's tax. And to my surprise, my opponent said she would keep the current tax structure. It doesn't quite make sense to me when you consider that New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, our nearest neighbors, all have a higher marginal rate at the very top level than we do. And to the extent that people are considering our region, that's where they look. So I don't think it's the first thing that we should consider. I do think that we need to look at efficiencies and other measures first. But if push comes to shove, I don't believe that it makes sense to ignore the fact that our top marginal tax rate is lower than that of New York, Massachusetts, or Rhode Island.
All right, thank you. You both have articulated how you personally differ from your years of experience and various perspectives. Connections within the General Assembly versus any outsider approach. But it seems that you both are agree on a great many things. Can you tell us how your policy views differ from your opponents? And then a follow-up to that is, if elected, what different decision will you make from what your opponent will make? It's a pretty complicated question. Pretty comprehensive there. Let's take the first part. Can you tell us how your policy views differ from your opponent? Who's first? I believe you are first.
So as someone who's serving in office, my job is to tell you what I've done and what I'm going to continue to do. I've taken note of the fact that when we first sat down and Jillian expressed interest in running in January to 3 days ago when the Hartford Courant ran a story, there aren't major policy differences that emerged. That's unusual because typically people run because they want to change things. The way to get change in the state of Connecticut, as I mentioned earlier, is to make sure that come November, we have progressive Democrats taking the seats of Trumpian Republicans and Democrats who vote like them. I don't think there are major policy differences, and I think that's a bit of a head scratcher in a Democratic primary.
Okay, Jillian?
Thank you for the question. When I knock doors, and I've now knocked more than 4,000 doors in this community, the number one thing I hear time and again is that people are concerned with their increasing taxes. People love living in West Hartford. We all love living in West Hartford. The majority of West Hartford is socially progressive. They are fighting for social justice issues. I've had folks at the door start to cry because of what is happening at the federal level, in particular with regards to immigrants. But they are also deeply concerned with the state budget, with the bipartisanship at the state legislature, and with what they see as inaction. And so from when we first did sit down and meet, I said that my running was about more than the issues we have in common. It's about the way we lead. And if you elect me, I am a different leader. I am not going to put my head in the sand and pretend that we can make 2-year budget fixes and it's all going to be okay. We need to make some big changes in this state. I'm also going to continue to engage you. That is my passion as a social worker. I want to hear from you. And I think that by continuing to communicate and have the hard conversations about what we need to change here in the state to move us forward, we are going to be able to move forward. So those are the big differences. It's how we lead. And after 23 years in office, this is where we're at. So let's elect someone new.
Just to be clear, I agree that when you knock people's doors, there are profound concerns about taxes. And the taxes that I hear most about are local property taxes, because people's home values have gone up, and so their property taxes have gone up. So state support for the town of West Hartford is critical. My opponent is a very energetic person. Her supporters are very energetic. But there's no first-year legislator who's able to show up and suddenly garner large amounts of state support for their community. You have to have relationships with those who are leaders of the chambers, with those who are leaders of the Appropriations Committee. I'm proud of having managed to protect West Hartford pretty well in a tough fiscal environment. And it's one of the reasons I'm running again. Frankly, I think it's pretty naive for my opponent or anyone to think that someone who's brand new is going to change the whole budget equation of the state of Connecticut overnight. What's needed is the sustained effort, and in this case, protection of some of the things that we won in the last 2 years.
Thank you. Okay. A question from the audience. I would like to know if you would support the other, that is, whichever one is elected, would you support your opponent after the election? And let's see. I think, Jillian, you go first. I think I've got that right.
What a difficult question when you're running against someone. And we only have a few days to go. Another major reason I'm running for office is to reinvigorate the Democratic Party here in Connecticut, to bring new voices to the table. And so I have been engaging folks during my campaign and would continue to support the Democratic Party, because I think we can be stronger. We can be a stronger party.
All right, thank you.
I think I heard in an indirect way that my opponent will support me if I win the primary. Let me just say very clearly, I will absolutely support my opponent if she prevails. It's critically important that we have progressive Democrats in the legislature. It's critically important that we hang together as a party. If we don't, and we divide ourselves, we potentially undermine the issues that we hold in common. So not only would I support my opponent, but I really feel strongly that every person who has a primary on Tuesday in the Democratic Party should make the same vow. That's how we win together.
Thank you. One question that hopefully will be a good one for both of you. What is the single most important issue facing the 18th District of West Hartford? And what would you propose to address it? And Jillian goes first.
Again, I'm going to say the most important issue is the state budget, because it is tied to so many of the things we care about. Again, knocking doors, I've met parents who have adult children with disabilities, and they are fearful because every year they are waiting to see if their child is going to get off that waiting list and get the services that they need. I've talked to folks who've attended Board of Ed budget hearings and are fearful that we aren't going to be able to pass an education budget. Again, I've met lots of people who moved to this community because this was the dream town for their kids to go to school, or our older residents who want to stay here but are fearing that they're going to have to move because of their taxes. And so my number one issue for this community is to get in there and to make sure we can clean up this budget mess that has been years in the making.
Andy?
So the most important issue for me is the most important issue for voters who I've spoken with, and that's making sure that local property taxes do not get pushed higher by a diminishment of state support. We have to make sure that state support for our town and our schools remains strong so that we can continue to be the terrific, caring community with the outstanding schools that gave me the education that allows me to be sitting here tonight, that's giving my children and my opponent's children a great education today. That's the critical issue, and it's the reason I'm running. I feel that I'll be able to protect the town in these turbulent times.
All right. We have 5 minutes left, and so I am going to ask the timers for the TV time. TV time has 5 minutes left, and so I'm going to ask the timers to set their clocks to give each of you 2 minutes for a closing statement or to address any question that you had hoped would come up and did not. All right, and the timers will let us know when they're ready. Okay, and Andy, why don't you go first?
Thank you. And I appreciate your making this opportunity available. There was no closing statements listed as an option when we were given the outline. So I think as you've heard here tonight, there are a range of progressive issues that are in front of the legislature in the next couple of years, where my opponent and I and most of the Democrats in this room believe we need progress. And so I guess I want to return to what was really one of the last questions asked about would we support each other after the primary. And I was a little surprised to hear my opponent say that was a hard one, because I really think for all of us in this room, for all of us in this country, that should be an easy one. We are facing a very scary national picture with a president who seems to me every day to issue some kind of new comment that undermines democracy, that delegitimizes the rights of immigrants who came here following every rule, jeopardizes programs like the Affordable Care Act that protects so many of us who need health care. So those of us who share the values that we in this room share have to be ready, not just to advocate for those issues, but to work together, come what may, on Tuesday, August 14th, so that we have victories. And that's going to mean making sure that the progressive Democrats who are running in the Northwest, the Northeast, the Southwest, the Southeast, that they score victories. At the same time, we're making sure that great senators like Beth Bayh and progressive seats like this one stay in the progressive category. That's how you get change, by making sure you win the big elections and get the votes that you need in both chambers and the signature that you need in the governor's office. I trust that Ned Lamont will give signatures to the bills that we've talked about, and I look forward to working with all of you, whatever may happen on Tuesday, August 14th, to make sure that we win these important victories.
Thank you, Andy. Jillian?
Thank you for the opportunity. I do want to thank my opponent for his years of public service, but I do feel like after 23 years, you get stagnant, or you think that the way things are done are the way things are done because that's the way they've always been done. We are the land of steady habits, and we need to break that. We're also the land of steady studies, and we need to break that too. It's time to take action. When I'm knocking doors, I've said this, but this is what I'm hearing. West Hartford residents want a change at the state capitol. And so my fear is that if we don't start electing Democrats who are willing to face Connecticut's budget problems, we're gonna see more Republicans get in, even though they don't have the budget solutions. But they're the ones having the conversation. And the reality is that in this state, many of the Republicans who are getting into office are not good on social justice issues. And so I think after 23 years, it is time for a change in the town of West Hartford. We need new leaders in the Democratic Party, and I would be honored to serve as your state representative. I've had 15 years of working on public policies. I teach students about political advocacy. My passion is creating and passing public policy that promotes the well-being of women, children, and families here in West Hartford and here in the state of Connecticut. And so please turn out on Tuesday, August 14th, and I would love your vote.
I'd like to thank you both on the behalf of the League and the television station, West Hartford Community Television, for taking on the challenge of running for elective office, a very important part of our democratic process, and we greatly appreciate it, and I know the audience does, and it's time for your applause. So again, thank you very much, and we also thank the League of Women Voters timers, Jean Blair and Vicki Albert, and our screeners, Gloria Bent and Mary Everett, and to all the staff. Thank you and good night.